The morning of October 7th, 1944, broke cold and colourless over the Hürtgen forest. Frost clung to the pine needles like shattered glass, and the air smelled of wet earth and cordite from the previous night's shelling. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched beside his Pak-40 anti-tank gun, its barrel still warm despite the chill, and watched the fog roll through the trees like the breath of ghosts. He was 23 years old, though the war had aged him into something harder. His hands, calloused from loading shells and digging positions, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette with a match that hissed in the damp. Around him, the remnants of his artillery section huddled in their foxholes, faces grey with exhaustion. They had been fighting in these woods for 2 weeks, and the Americans kept coming, wave after wave, like a tide that refused to break. Hartmann's crew had held this position through 3 assaults. They had destroyed 2 Sherman tanks and disabled a half-track, but the cost had been severe. His loader, a boy from Hamburg named Fischer, had been killed by shrapnel the day before. Now only 4 men remained: Hartmann, his gunner Erich Vogel, a runner named Schmidt, and their section commander, Feldwebel Otto Brenner, a veteran of the Eastern Front whose silence carried more weight than orders. The forest around them was dying. American artillery had turned the ancient pines into splintered skeletons, their trunks scarred black from phosphorus and high explosive. The ground was cratered, churned into a landscape that looked less like Germany and more like the surface of a dead moon. Yet still, the Americans advanced, and with them came a sound that had begun to haunt Hartmann's sleep. It started as a distant hammering, rapid and mechanical, like a carpenter's nail gun magnified 1,000 times. Then it grew closer, a tearing sound that ripped through the air and shredded the forest itself. The Americans called it the Mar-Deuce, the 50 caliber. Hartmann had heard the stories whispered among the infantry, tales of a machine gun so fast, so brutal, that it could saw men in half and punch through light armour as if it were paper. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of myth soldiers told to explain their fear. German machine guns were the finest in the world. The MG-42, with its terrifying cyclic rate, had earned the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw for good reason. 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound so distinctive that Allied troops could identify it instantly. Hartmann had served beside MG-42 crews in Normandy, watched them cut down entire squads with surgical precision. He believed, as they all did, that German engineering was superior. That quality would triumph over quantity. But the sound coming through the trees now was different. It was not the rapid stutter of the MG-42, but something slower, heavier, more deliberate. Each round seemed to carry its own weight, its own intention, and when those rounds struck, they did not wound, they destroyed. Brenner crawled over to Hartmann's position, his face streaked with mud and ash. The Feldwebel's eyes, once sharp and commanding, had grown hollow over the weeks. He had seen too much, lost too many men. "They're coming again," he said quietly, nodding toward the fog-shrouded forest ahead. "I heard movement, maybe a platoon, maybe more." Hartmann ground out his cigarette and checked his ammunition. They had 12 armour-piercing rounds left for the Pak-40, enough for 2 tanks if they were lucky. If the Americans came with infantry first, they would have to rely on their rifles and the single MG-34 they had scavenged from a destroyed position. It was not enough. It had never been enough. "Do we have support?" Vogel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was 19, a gunner who still flinched at the sound of incoming shells, despite months of combat. Brenner shook his head. Battalion pulled back during the night. We're the rear guard now. Hold until dark, then fall back to the secondary line. Hold until dark. The words were a death sentence wrapped in military courtesy. Hartmann looked at Schmidt, the runner, a thin boy with nervous hands who had joined them only a week ago. He was staring at the trees, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Stay low," Hartmann told him. "When they come, don't expose yourself. Let the gun do the work." The fog began to thin as the sun climbed higher, burning through the mist in pale shafts of light. And then, through the grey veil, Hartmann saw them, American infantry, moving cautiously through the trees, rifles raised, helmets dull green against the frost. They advanced in pairs, covering each other, their movements disciplined and methodical. Behind them, something larger moved through, the undergrowth. Brenner raised his hand, signalling silence. The Pick 40's barrel tracked the movement, Vogel's hands steady on the traverse wheel. Hartmann could hear his own heartbeat, a dull thud that seemed louder than the distant rumble of artillery. The Americans were close now, close enough that he could see the stubble on their faces, the weariness in their eyes. They looked no different from his own men, tired, cold, afraid. Then the sound came, a sudden, brutal hammering that tore through the forest like the voice of God rendered in steel. The trees ahead erupted in splinters and bark, entire trunks shredded as if by invisible knives. The noise was overwhelming, not the high-pitched scream of the MG-42, but a deeper, more primal roar. It was the sound of mass being converted into velocity, of metal moving so fast it carved reality itself. Hartmann pressed himself into the frozen earth, his breath coming in short gasps. Around him, his crew did the same, flattening themselves, as the rounds tore overhead. He had been under fire before, had felt the crack of rifle bullets and the concussion of mortar shells. But this was different. This was not suppression. This was obliteration. The American machine gun fire lasted only 10 seconds, but in that span, the world changed. When it stopped, Hartmann lifted his head and looked at the forest ahead. The trees where the gun had been aimed no longer existed. In their place stood ragged stumps, their tops sheared away as cleanly as if cut by a saw. Branches lay scattered across the ground, some still smoking. The air smelled of burned wood and hot metal. "Mein Gott," Vogel whispered, his face pale. "What was that?" Brenner did not answer. He was staring at the destruction with an expression Hartmann had never seen on the Feldwebel's face before. Not fear, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that they were fighting something beyond their comprehension. The Americans advanced again, and this time Hartmann saw it. A heavy machine gun mounted on a tripod, its barrel thick and long, tended by a crew of 3 men. One fed the belt, another steadied the weapon, and the gunner, a stocky man with his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, sighted down the barrel with calm precision. The gun itself looked almost brutish in its simplicity. No elegant lines or careful engineering, just a block of steel designed to do one thing with absolute efficiency. The gunner fired again, a short burst this time, aiming at a German position to Hartmann's left. The sound was the same, that deep, tearing roar, and the position simply ceased to exist. Earth and sandbags flew into the air, and when the dust settled, Hartmann could see the broken outline of a machine gun nest, its occupants silent. "Return fire," Brenner shouted, his voice cracking. Hartmann swung the Pak 40 toward the American gun, but before Vogel could fire, the enemy weapon spoke again. This time, the rounds came directly at them, The first burst hit the ground 5 meters short, throwing up geysers of frozen dirt. The second walked closer, each round impacting with a force that shook the earth. Hartman saw one bullet strike a tree trunk and punch completely through it, the wood exploding outward in a spray of splinters. Another hit a rock and turned it into shrapnel. These were not bullets. They were hammers. "Traverse left!" Hartman screamed, but it was too late. The third burst found them. A 50 caliber round struck the Pak-40's gun shield with a sound like a church bell being struck by lightning. The steel plate, designed to stop rifle fire and shrapnel, buckled inward as if made of tin. Vogel screamed and fell backward, blood streaming from his face where fragments had torn across his cheek. Hartman grabbed him and dragged him into the foxhole as another burst tore overhead. Schmidt was firing his rifle blindly, his face streaked with tears. Brenner was shouting orders, but the words were lost in the gone chaos. The American machine gun had found its rhythm now, firing in measured bursts, each one precise and devastating. Hartman watched as entire sections of their defensive line simply vanished under the onslaught. The forest had become a slaughterhouse. Trees fell in slow motion, their roots torn from the earth. Foxholes collapsed under direct hits, and everywhere the sound of that gun, that terrible, relentless hammering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hartman pressed himself against the frozen earth and realized, with sudden clarity, that everything he had believed was a lie. The superiority of German arms, the invincibility of their tactics, the promise that discipline and courage would prevail, all of it dust. The Americans had not defeated them with genius or cunning. They had simply brought a gun that fired faster, hit harder, and never seemed to run out of ammunition. He thought of the MG-42, that marvel of engineering with its complex recoil system and precision-machined parts. It could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, yes, but it overheated quickly, required constant barrel changes, and jammed if not meticulously maintained. The American gun was cruder, simpler, but it kept firing. And in war, Hartman realized, reliability was worth more than perfection. Vogel groaned beside him, clutching his face. Blood seeped between his fingers. "We have to fall back," he gasped. "We can't fight that." Brenner crawled over, his uniform torn and filthy. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at the ruined forest around them. Then he nodded slowly. "Pull back," he ordered. "Leave the gun. Move now." They ran, bent low, scrambling through the undergrowth as the American machine gun swept the forest behind them. Hartman could hear the rounds cracking past, each one close enough to feel the displacement of air. Schmidt went down first, hit in the leg, and Hartman dragged him up, half carrying him as they stumbled toward the rear. Behind them, the sound of the 50 caliber continued, relentless and mechanical, chewing through everything in its path. And as Hartman ran, gasping for breath, he understood that this was not just a weapon. It was a message, a declaration written in steel and fire that said, very simply, "You cannot win." The forest swallowed them, and the sound faded into the distance, but it never truly left. That night, huddled in a new position kilometers behind the line, Hartman sat with his back against a tree and stared at nothing. His hands still shook. Vogel lay nearby, his face bandaged, eyes closed. Schmidt wept quietly, his wounded leg wrapped in a crude tourniquet. Brenner sat apart from them, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. He did not speak, but Hartman could see it in his eyes. The same realization that had struck him in that moment under fire. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting a civilization that built machines like other nations built monuments. And those machines did not tire, did not doubt, did not fear. Hartman closed his eyes and heard it again. That sound. 850 rounds per minute, someone had said, though he suspected the number was wrong. It didn't matter. Fast or slow, the result was the same. Everything shredded. Everything gone. He thought of the PAK-40, that beautiful gun with its high-velocity barrel and carefully calculated ballistics, destroyed in seconds by a weapon that looked like it had been built in a factory by workers who had never seen war. And he understood, finally, what the Americans had done. They had not tried to build the perfect weapon. They had built the weapon that worked, and they had built it by the thousands. End of Part 1. Approximately 2,100 words. The morning after the retreat tasted like copper and ash. Hartman and the remnants of his section had been folded into a reserve battery positioned near the village of Wassenach, a collection of shattered stone houses clinging to a hillside that overlooked the Karl River Valley. The position was supposed to be safer, farther from the front, but safety was a relative term in the Hürtgen forest. Here, death came not in waves, but in whispers, sniper fire, random shelling, and the constant dread of the next American advance. The battery now consisted of 3 PAK-40 guns, 2 MG-34 machine guns, and perhaps 30 men, most of them teenagers or men in their 40s who had been pulled from factory jobs and handed rifles. Their commander was Hauptmann Dieter Kessler, a career officer with a face like weathered stone and eyes that had seen too many fronts. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried the weight of exhausted authority. Hartman sat in a dugout carved into the hillside, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of mildew and old sweat. Across from him, Vogel lay on a stretcher, his face still bandaged, one eye swollen shut. The medic had done what he could, but infection was setting in. Vogel would need real medical care soon, and everyone knew he wouldn't get it. The field hospitals were overwhelmed, and transport to the rear was reserved for officers and critical cases. Schmidt sat nearby, his wounded leg propped on an ammunition crate. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone, but he could barely walk. He stared at the dirt floor, saying nothing, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. Brenner had disappeared shortly after they arrived, called to a briefing with Kessler. When he returned an hour later, his expression was darker than before. "They want us to counterattack," he said flatly, sitting down on an overturned bucket. "Tomorrow morning. Orders from division." Hartman looked up. "With what?" he asked. "We have 3 guns and half a company of walking wounded." "With what we have," Brenner replied. His voice carried no emotion, only the resignation of a man who had stopped questioning insanity. "The Americans took the ridge to the north. Division wants it back. They think, if we can retake it, we can stabilize the line." "They think," Vogel muttered from his stretcher, his voice thick with pain. "They always think. And we always die." Brenner said nothing. He pulled out a cigarette, one of his last, and lit it with a match that flared briefly in the dim light. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the shadows of the dugout. Outside, the sound of distant artillery rumbled like a storm that would never break. He lay on the cold ground, his rifle beside him, and listened to the breathing of the men around him. Some snored, exhausted beyond fear. Others lay silent, staring at the wooden beams above them. He thought about the 50 caliber machine gun, that brutal mechanical voice that had torn his world apart. He wondered how many of them the Americans had, whether they were as common as rifles, whether every squad carried one. The thought was almost unbearable. If that were true, if the Americans had built such weapons in the same numbers they built tanks and trucks and aircraft, then the war was already over. Not because Germany lacked courage or discipline, but because they had never understood the nature of the fight. They had prepared for a duel of skill. The Americans had brought an avalanche. He must have dozed, because when he opened his eyes, the dugout was filled with pale grey light. Dawn had come, and with it, the order to move. The men stirred slowly, their movements stiff and reluctant. Hartmann sat up and reached for his rifle, checking the action out of habit. Beside him, Schmidt struggled to stand, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. "You're staying here," Hartmann told him. "You can't walk." "I can shoot," Schmidt replied, his jaw set. "That's enough." Brenner entered the dugout, his face grim. "Assemble outside. We move in 10 minutes. He looked at Vogel, still lying on the stretcher, and for a moment something like regret crossed his features. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of duty. "Someone stay with him," he said. "Everyone else, let's go." They formed up in a small clearing just below the crest of the hill. 32 men, Hartmann counted. 32 against however many Americans held the ridge. Kessler stood before them, his uniform clean despite the mud and chaos around them. He spoke briefly, his voice steady and formal, about duty and the fatherland and the necessity of sacrifice. Hartmann heard the words, but did not absorb them. He was watching the tree line to the north, wondering what waited beyond it. When Kessler finished, they moved out, advancing through the forest in a loose skirmish line. The morning was quiet, almost peaceful. Birds sang in the trees, and frost glittered on the fallen leaves. It felt obscene, this beauty, as if nature had forgotten there was a war. They reached the base of the ridge without incident and began to climb. The slope was steep, covered in thick undergrowth and fallen logs. Hartmann's breath came in short gasps, his legs burning from the effort. Around him, the other men struggled upward, their faces red with exertion. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional scrape of a rifle against a tree. Halfway up, they found the first bodies, German infantry, killed in the previous day's fighting. They lay scattered among the trees, their uniforms stiff with frost, their faces turned toward the sky. Hartmann forced himself not to look too closely, but he saw enough. Massive wounds, limbs torn away, torsos opened by impacts that no rifle could have made. The .50 caliber had been here. They climbed higher, and the bodies grew more numerous. Some had been there for days, their flesh grey and sunken. Others were fresh, killed only hours before. The smell of death hung in the air, sweet and rotten, mixing with the scent of pine and cold earth. Hartmann's stomach churned, but he kept moving. To stop was to think, and thinking was dangerous. Near the crest of the ridge, Brenner raised his fist, signalling a halt. The men dropped into cover, their rifles ready. Ahead, through the trees, Hartmann could see the outline of a trench system, the German positions they had been ordered to retake. Smoke still rose from one of the dugouts, thin and grey against the morning sky. Kessler moved forward, crouching low, and peered through a pair of binoculars. After a long moment, he lowered them and turned to Brenner. "The Americans are dug in," he said quietly. "I count at least 2 machine gun positions, maybe a platoon's worth of infantry." "What about armour?" Brenner asked. "None that I can see. But that doesn't mean it's not close." Brenner nodded. He turned to the men behind him and gestured forward. "First section, advance on the left flank. Second section, centre. Artillery crews, stay back and provide fire support if needed. On my signal." They waited, the seconds, stretching into minutes. Hartmann could feel his heart pounding, a dull rhythm that seemed too loud. Beside him, Schmidt was breathing hard, his face pale. Somewhere to the right, a man whispered a prayer, the words barely audible. Then Brenner's arm dropped, and they moved. The attack began with a rush, the men breaking from cover and sprinting toward the trench line. For a moment, there was no response. The forest remained silent, almost mocking in its stillness. Hartmann ran, his rifle clutched tightly, his boots slipping on the frozen ground. He could see the trench now, could see the sandbags and the dark outline of a machine gun position. And then the Americans opened fire. The sound was instant and overwhelming. Rifle fire cracked from a dozen positions, the bullets snapping through the air with lethal precision. Men fell, some silently, others screaming. Hartmann threw himself behind a fallen log as rounds tore into the wood, sending splinters flying. He could hear the shouts of the wounded, the desperate cries for medics who would never come. But the rifle fire was only the beginning. A moment later, the .50 caliber spoke. It was the same sound, that deep, mechanical roar, but closer now, so close that Hartmann could feel it in his chest. The rounds tore through the forest with a violence that defied comprehension. Trees exploded. The ground erupted. Men disappeared, not killed but erased, their bodies torn apart so completely that nothing recognizable remained. Hartmann pressed himself into the earth, his hands over his head, as the world came apart around him. He heard Schmidt scream, a high, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. He turned and saw the boy lying on his back, clutching his stomach, blood pouring between his fingers. Hartmann reached for him, but another burst from the .50 caliber tore overhead, and he was forced back down. The counterattack lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, 20 of the 32 men were dead or dying. The survivors retreated in a panicked rout, scrambling back down the ridge, leaving their weapons and their wounded behind. Hartmann ran with them, his lungs burning, his mind blank with terror. Behind him, the sound of the American machine gun continued, methodical and unhurried, cutting down the stragglers. They reached the base of the ridge and collapsed, gasping for air. Kessler was there, his face twisted with fury and helplessness. Brenner knelt beside a tree, vomiting into the dirt. Hartmann looked back toward the ridge and saw the smoke rising from where his comrades had fallen. Schmidt was still up there. So were a dozen others. And there was nothing they could do. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That night, back in the dugout, the survivors sat in silence. No one spoke of the attack, of the friends they had lost, of the impossibility of what they had been ordered to do. Vogel was dead, his infection having taken him sometime during the day. His body lay covered in a corner, waiting for burial that might never come. Hartmann stared at his hands. They were shaking, and he could not make them stop. He thought of Schmidt, of the boy's terrified face in those final moments. He thought of the .50 caliber, of its relentless mechanical voice, and he thought of the truth that had been growing inside him since that first encounter in the forest. They could not win this war, not against this. Not against an enemy that could produce such weapons in such numbers, that could rain steel down upon them without mercy or end. The Americans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like a force of nature, overwhelming and indifferent. Brenner sat across from him, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I served in Russia," he said. "I saw things there that I thought were the worst the war could offer. But this—" He paused, his hands stilling on the weapon. "This is different. The Russians fought with desperation. The Americans fight with confidence. They know they've already won." Hartmann said nothing. There was nothing to say. Outside, the sound of distant artillery continued, a low rumble that had become the soundtrack of their lives. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps only kilometers away, he imagined the Americans sitting around their own fires, their 50-caliber machine guns cleaned and ready, waiting for the next day, the next battle, the next inevitable victory. The war would go on for months still, but for Hartmann it had already ended, shredded in seconds by a gun that never should have existed, built by a nation that turned industry into warfare with the same efficiency it once turned farms into cities. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the sound remained, that hammering, that terrible, endless hammering. The days that followed blurred together into a single, unending nightmare. The Hürtgen forest had become a graveyard where the living and the dead existed in the same spaces, separated only by the thinnest margin of chance. Hartmann's section, what remained of it, was pulled back to a reserve position near the town of Schmidt, a cluster of ruins that had once been a mining village. Now it was nothing but rubble and smoke, a place where soldiers waited to die. They had lost Brenner 3 days after the failed counterattack. An American patrol had stumbled upon their position at dawn, and in the brief, savage firefight that followed, the Feldwebel had taken a bullet through the throat. He had died quickly, choking on his own blood, his eyes wide with surprise. Hartmann had held him as he went, feeling the life drain away, and afterward had taken the man's rank insignia and placed it in his pocket. It seemed important to keep something, some small token that Brenner had existed. Now Hartmann was in command, though command meant little when you had only 8 men left. They were a collection of survivors from different units, thrown together by circumstance and attrition. There was Gefreiter Paul Richter, a machine gunner from Hamburg, whose hands never stopped trembling. Schütze Ernst Becker, a 19-year-old from Bavaria, who still believed Germany would find a way to win. And Obergefreiter Hans Weber, a veteran of North Africa whose silence had grown absolute after watching his entire squad die in a single artillery barrage. They slept in the basement of a destroyed church, its walls scorched black from fire, its floor covered in broken stone and shattered stained glass. At night, they could hear the Americans moving in the forest, the rumble of their trucks, the distant clatter of their machinery. The sound was constant, a reminder that beyond the tree line, the enemy was not resting. They were building, preparing, bringing forward more weapons, more ammunition, more of everything. On the 5th day, orders came down from what remained of battalion headquarters. A German counteroffensive was being planned, a desperate attempt to push the Americans back and reclaim the initiative. Every available unit was to be committed. Hartmann read the order twice, then folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He did not tell his men. There was no point in giving them more time to be afraid. That evening, as the sun set behind the broken spires of the church, Hartmann sat alone on a pile of rubble and stared at the horizon. The sky was streaked with red and orange, beautiful in a way that felt obscene. He thought about his home in Cologne, about his mother and sister, about whether they were still alive. The city had been bombed repeatedly, turned into a landscape of ruins. He had not heard from them in 6 months. He thought about the war, about how it had begun with such certainty, such faith in victory. He remembered the newsreels, the parades, the speeches, promising a new order, a 1,000-year Reich. It had all seemed so inevitable then, so right. But now, sitting in the ruins of a country that was tearing itself apart, he could see the truth. They had been children playing with matches, and the fire had consumed them. Weber approached, his boots crunching on the broken glass. He sat down beside Hartmann without speaking, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with practiced efficiency. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I captured an American rifle once," he said, his voice rough from disuse. In Tunisia, a Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, beautiful piece of engineering. Hartmann glanced at him. What happened to it? Gave it to an officer. He wanted a souvenir. Weber took a long drag on his cigarette. But before I did, I field stripped it. Wanted to see how it worked. You know what I found? It was simple, stupidly simple. No complex mechanisms, no precision machining, just solid design and good materials. I remember thinking, this is what we should have been making. Not perfect weapons for perfect conditions, just weapons that work. Hartmann nodded slowly. He understood what Weber was saying. The German military had always prized engineering excellence, the idea that superior technology would compensate for inferior numbers. They had built the Tiger tank, the MG-42, the Me-262 jet fighter. Masterpieces of design that required skilled crews, constant maintenance, and resources they did not have. The Americans had built the Sherman, the M1 Garand, the P-51 Mustang. Good enough weapons, produced in quantities that made excellence irrelevant. I saw one of their machine guns up close, Hartmann said quietly. After that first attack, it was just lying there in the mud, abandoned. The crew had moved forward. He paused, remembering. I wanted to destroy it. Thought about throwing a grenade, putting it out of action. But I didn't. I just stood there looking at it. It wouldn't have mattered. They have thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. One more or less changes nothing. Weber crushed his cigarette under his boot. That's the difference, isn't it? We fight like craftsmen, they fight like a factory. The next morning, the counter-offensive began. It was a disaster from the start. The German forces, weakened by months of attrition and supplied with dwindling ammunition, advanced into prepared American positions with predictable results. Hartmann's section was ordered to provide covering fire for an infantry assault on a wooded ridge. They set up their MG-34 behind a fallen tree and waited. The infantry went forward at dawn, moving through the fog-shrouded forest in loose formations. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the Americans opened up, and the forest erupted in fire. Rifle shots cracked from a dozen positions. Mortar rounds began falling, their explosions throwing up geysers of earth and shrapnel. And then, cutting through it all, came the sound Hartmann had learned to dread. The .50 caliber. It fired from somewhere ahead, hidden in the trees, its bullets tearing through the German infantry like they were made of paper. Hartmann watched through his binoculars as men were cut down, their bodies jerking and spinning as the heavy rounds struck them. Some fell instantly, others stumbled a few steps before collapsing. The attack dissolved in seconds, the survivors fleeing back toward the German lines in panic. "Return fire!" Hartmann shouted to Richter, who was manning the MG-34. The machine gun chattered to life, its familiar sound almost comforting in its predictability. But the American gun answered immediately, and what followed was not a duel but an execution. The .50 caliber rounds tore into their position with horrifying accuracy. The tree they were hiding behind exploded in a shower of splinters. The ground around them erupted as bullets punched into the earth, each impact creating a small crater. Richter screamed and rolled away from the gun, his hands clutched to his face where a splinter had driven into his eye. Hartmann grabbed him and dragged him into a shell crater, pressing them both into the mud as the American guns swept overhead. He could hear the rounds passing, could feel the displacement of air, could smell the hot metal and burned powder. It was like being inside a storm made of steel. The firing stopped, and in the sudden silence, Hartmann heard something that made his blood run cold. Laughter. American laughter, carried on the wind from somewhere ahead. Not cruel or mocking, just the easy laughter of men who knew they had won, who knew that no matter what the Germans tried, the result would be the same. They retreated again, carrying Richter between them. The young machine gunner was half blind now, his face a mask of blood. He kept mumbling about his mother, about going home, about how he had only joined up because his friends had. Hartmann listened and said, nothing. There was nothing to say. That afternoon, as they huddled in a new position farther back, Hartmann finally understood what Weber had been trying to tell him. This war was not being decided by tactics or courage or even technology. It was being decided by capacity. The Americans could afford to lose. They could lose tanks, lose guns, lose men, and still come back the next day with more. Germany could not. Every loss was irreplaceable, every retreat a step closer to oblivion. He thought about the .50 caliber again, that brutal, simple machine. Someone had told him it had been designed before the war, back in the 1920s. That meant the Americans had been building it for 2 decades, perfecting the manufacturing process, training workers, stockpiling ammunition. By the time the war started, they could produce them as easily as rifles. Germany had spent those same years building monuments to Hitler's ego, hosting rallies, and planning conquests. They had prepared a short war, a war of maneuver and lightning strikes. The Americans had prepared for a long war, a war of attrition and industrial might, and in that difference lay everything. As darkness fell, Hartmann sat with his back against a tree and pulled out Brenner's rank insignia. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. The Feldwebel had been a good soldier, a good leader. He had followed orders, done his duty, believed in the cause. And he had died in a muddy trench in a forest that did not matter, killed by an enemy he had never seen. Becker approached, his young face drawn with exhaustion. Obergefreiter, he said quietly, some of the men are talking about surrendering. They say the war is lost. Hartmann looked up at him. What do you think? I think. Becker hesitated, his voice breaking. I think they might be right. Then why are you still here? Because I don't know what else to do. Hartmann stood, placing the insignia back in his pocket. Neither do I, he admitted. But we're still soldiers. Until someone tells us otherwise, we keep fighting. Even if it's hopeless? Especially if it's hopeless. Because the moment we stop, we admit that every man who died before us died for nothing. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the lie that kept them moving, kept them functioning. Without it, there was only the abyss. The following week, something changed. American patrols became more aggressive, probing deeper into German positions. Their artillery intensified, pounding the forest day and night. And then, on a cold morning in late October, Hartmann's section encountered something they had only heard rumors about. They were moving through a ravine, trying to reach a supply depot, when they stumbled upon an abandoned American position. It had been hastily evacuated, equipment left behind in the rush to advance. Among the debris, Hartmann found it, a .50 caliber machine gun. It sat on its tripod, barrel still warm, a belt of ammunition draped across the receiver. The Americans had left it behind, either because they had been forced to withdraw quickly, or because, Hartmann realized with a chill, they simply did not need it. They had so many that losing one was meaningless. The men gathered around it, staring as if it were a religious artifact. Weber reached out and touched the barrel, pulling his hand back quickly from the heat. Mein Gott, he whispered. It's real. Of course it's real, Becker said, but his voice carried no conviction. Seeing it up close, silent and inert, somehow made it more terrifying. This was the thing that had killed so many of their comrades, that had torn through trees and armor and flesh with equal ease. Hartmann knelt beside it, examining the mechanism. It was exactly as Weber had described, the Garand, simple and robust. The bolt was massive, the barrel thick and heavy. There was no elegance here, no artistry, just pure, mechanical efficiency. He found himself thinking of the MG-42, with its intricate roller-locked bolt and quick-change barrel system, a masterpiece of engineering that required trained armorers and constant care. This American gun looked like something a farmer could maintain with a hammer and a wrench. "Can we use it?" Richter asked. He was still with them, despite his injury, a bandage wrapped around his ruined eye. He refused to go to the aid station, knowing he would never come back. Hartmann stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. "I don't know," he said. But even as he spoke, he was thinking. They had found 3 ammunition boxes nearby, each containing 100 rounds. 300 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. If they could figure out how to fire it, they would have more firepower than their entire section combined. Weber was already examining the gun's mechanism, his experienced hands moving over the metal with confidence. "It's not that different from ours," he said. "Open bolt, belt-fed, gas-operated. The principles are the same." He looked up at Hartmann. "I think I can make it work." They spent an hour stripping the gun down and reassembling it, learning its secrets. It was heavier than the MG-42, more cumbersome, but also more solid. Where the German gun felt like a racing car, all speed and precision, the American weapon felt like a truck, built to take punishment and keep running. Finally, Weber loaded a belt and chambered a round. The bolt slammed forward with a sound like a steel door closing. He looked at Hartmann. "Ready?" Hartmann nodded. Short burst. "Aim at that tree." Weber settled behind the gun, his hands finding the spade grips naturally. He sighted down the barrel, took a breath, and pressed the trigger. The sound was exactly as Hartmann remembered, that deep, hammering roar. But experiencing it from behind the gun was different. He could feel the power of it, the way each round left the barrel with enough force to make the whole weapon shudder. The tree Weber had aimed at, a thick pine about 50 meters away, simply disintegrated. The trunk split in half, the top portion crashing down in a shower of needles and branches. Weber lifted his hands from the gun, staring at it with something like reverence. "Mein Gott," he said again. "This is what we've been facing?" The men stood in stunned silence. They had all been on the receiving end of this weapon's fire, but seeing what it could do from this perspective was different. It was not just a gun. It was a statement of industrial and tactical philosophy. The Americans had decided they needed a heavy machine gun that could destroy light vehicles, punch through cover, and suppress enemy positions from long range. So they had built thousands of it, and distributed it down to the squad level. Germany had the MG-42, a weapon optimized for rate of fire and infantry support. It was brilliant at what it did. But the 50 caliber did things the MG-42 could not. It reached farther, hit harder, destroyed more. And the Americans had so many of them that they could afford to leave one behind. Hartmann made a decision. "We're taking it," he said. "Strip it down, distribute the parts. Weber, you're the gunner. Richter, you'll be the loader once you learn the system." "What about the officers?" Becker asked nervously. "They'll want to know where we got it." "Let them ask," Hartmann replied. His voice carried a hardness that surprised even himself. We found enemy equipment and captured it. That's what soldiers do. They spent the rest of the day learning the gun's intricacies, practicing loading drills and barrel changes. The weapon was different from what they were used to, but not impossibly so. By evening, they could operate it with reasonable efficiency. Weber had a natural affinity for it, his hands moving over the mechanism with growing confidence. That night, they set up a defensive position in a ruined farmhouse on the edge of the forest. The 50 caliber was mounted in a second story, a window, its barrel pointing down the road that led toward the American lines. They had 200 rounds left after the practice session. Not much, but more firepower than they had possessed in weeks. Hartmann sat beside the gun, running his hand along the barrel. It was cold now, the heat from their test firing long since dissipated. He thought about the American crew that had abandoned it, wondered where they were now. Probably miles ahead, manning a new gun, part of an endless conveyor belt of men and material that just kept coming. He thought about what this weapon represented. Not just firepower, but a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached war. Germany had tried to win through excellence, through the genius of individual weapons and tactics. America had won through abundance, through the simple expedient of having more of everything. More guns, more ammunition, more factories, more workers, more oil, more food. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. The 50 caliber fired only about 500, but the Americans had so many 50 calibers that the math did not matter. And each of those 50 caliber rounds hit with 3 times the energy of the MG-42's bullets. Quality versus quantity was a false choice when quantity was itself a kind of quality. Weber interrupted his thoughts. Obergefreiter, I've been thinking. About what? About why they left it behind. Weber gestured at the gun. This thing probably costs more than a car. It's not something you just abandon unless you have to. Maybe they were under fire. Maybe they had to move fast. Maybe. Weber did not sound convinced. Or maybe they knew they'd get another one. Maybe to them this is just equipment, replaceable. The thought settled over them like a weight. To the Americans, a 50 caliber machine gun was not a precious asset to be guarded and maintained at all costs. It was a tool, one of many, easily replaced if lost. That casual abundance spoke to, a depth of industrial power that was almost incomprehensible. Hartmann remembered a story Brenner had told him once, about the Eastern Front. A Russian commander, when asked how he planned to deal with German armor superiority, had supposedly said, "We will drown them in T-34 seconds. Quantity as strategy." The Americans had taken that concept and perfected it. They did not just have more tanks and guns. They had more of everything, from boots to bullets to bandages. Germany had prepared for a war of maneuver, where skill and technology would prevail. America had prepared for a war of production, where victory went to whoever could sustain the effort longest. And in that fundamental miscalculation lay the entire story of the war. As night deepened, Hartmann posted guards and tried to sleep. But sleep was elusive, haunted by the sound of that gun, the hammering that had become the voice of his defeat. Tomorrow they would move again, fall back to another position, fight another delaying action. And eventually, the Americans would come, with their endless supplies and their terrible guns. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Hartmann's section had a 50 caliber machine gun, and if the enemy came, they would learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their own weapon. It was a small victory, meaningless in the grand scheme of the war, but in that moment it felt like enough. Weber settled behind the gun, his hands resting on the grips. If they come, he said quietly, we'll make them pay. Hartman nodded. Yes, he agreed. We will. And in the darkness, with the cold metal of the American gun beside them, they waited for the dawn. The dawn came with fog, thick and grey, rolling through the forest like a living thing. Hartman woke to the sound of distant engines, the deep rumble of trucks moving along the road that ran through the valley below. He pulled himself up and moved to the window where Weber sat behind the .50 caliber, his single eye, scanning the tree line. Hartman asked. Can't tell yet. At least a convoy, maybe a full company. The other men stirred, taking up positions at the windows and in the ruins of the farmhouse's ground floor. They had 8 rifles, 1 MG-34, and now the captured .50 caliber. Against a full American company, it was nothing. But it was what they had. The fog began to thin as the sun rose higher, and through it, Hartman could see them, American infantry, advancing in a loose skirmish line along both sides of the road. Behind them, trucks and half-tracks moved cautiously, their commanders visible in the turrets. This was not a probe. This was a full advance, the Americans pushing forward to consolidate their gains. Hold fire, Hartman ordered quietly. Let them get closer. The Americans came on, confident, their weapons held casually. They were not expecting resistance. Why would they? The German forces in this sector had been shattered, pushed back day after day. This was supposed to be a mop-up operation, securing ground already won. Weber's hands tightened on the .50 caliber's grips. Beside him, Richter crouched with the ammunition belt, ready to feed. Below, Becker and the others aimed their rifles, fingers on triggers, waiting for the order. The American column drew closer. 50 meters. 40. Hartman could see their faces now, could see the weariness in their eyes, the same exhaustion his own men carried. They were just soldiers, doing what soldiers do, following orders, trying to survive. Now, Hartman said. Weber opened fire. The .50 caliber roared to life, and in that instant, Hartman understood everything. The sound was immense, overwhelming, a physical force that shook the ruins around them. But more than that, he felt the power of it, the terrible efficiency. Each round that left the barrel carried enough energy to punch through an engine block. The Americans had distributed this power down to the squad level, had built enough of these weapons that they could afford to leave them behind. The effect on the American column was immediate and catastrophic. The heavy rounds tore through the infantry, each bullet capable of hitting multiple men. The truck's thin armor meant nothing. Weber walked his fire down the road, methodical and precise, and vehicles exploded, men fell, chaos erupted from order. The MG-34 joined in, its faster rate of fire complementing the .50 caliber's raw power. Rifles cracked from the windows. For perhaps 30 seconds, Hartmann's tiny section held the initiative, pouring fire into an enemy that had not expected resistance. Then the Americans responded. They were professionals, trained and experienced. Squads peeled off the road, taking cover and returning fire. A half-track's machine gun swung toward the farmhouse, and bullets began chewing into the walls. Hartman saw an American officer shouting orders, saw men moving with practiced efficiency to flank their position. And then he heard it, another .50 caliber, answering theirs. The American gunner had found a position behind one of the trucks and opened fire. The farmhouse's second floor disintegrated under the onslaught. Bricks and mortar exploded, beams cracked and fell. Weber kept firing, but now they were in a duel, .50 caliber against .50 caliber, and the Americans had support, had ammunition, had reinforcements coming. "Fall back," Hartmann shouted. "Everyone out, now!" They abandoned the gun, Weber and Richter scrambling away from the window as more American fire poured in. The men tumbled down the stairs, racing for the back door. Behind them, the farmhouse was coming apart, the American heavy weapons reducing it to rubble. They ran through the forest, American bullets snapping at their heels. Behind them, the sound of the battle faded into the distance. They had inflicted casualties, had disrupted the American advance for perhaps 10 minutes, and in return, they had lost their position, lost the captured gun, lost any illusion that they could fight back effectively. That evening, reunited with what remained of the battalion in a muddy trench system 5 kilometers behind where they had started the day, Hartmann sat with his head in his hands. They had used the Americans' own weapon against them, had felt its power, had understood finally what they were facing, and it had made no difference. Becker sat beside him, his rifle across his knees. "We killed maybe a dozen of them," he said quietly. "Maybe more." "And tomorrow," Hartmann replied, "a dozen more will take their place, and the day after that, another dozen. They have the men, they have the weapons, they have everything." Weber approached, his face blackened with powder smoke. "The gun," he said. "We should have taken it with us." "It wouldn't have mattered," Hartmann said. "We barely had enough ammunition for one fight. And even if we'd had more, it wouldn't change anything. This war is over. We just haven't admitted it. Yet." The words hung in the cold air, and no one contradicted him. They all knew the truth. Germany was bleeding out, one position at a time, one soldier at a time. The Americans would keep coming, would keep bringing their endless supplies of weapons and men, and eventually there would be nothing left to stop them. That night, as Hartmann lay in the mud trying to sleep, he thought about the .50 caliber one last time, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. The Americans had built it not to be perfect, but to be good enough. And they had built so many of them that good enough had become overwhelming. Germany had tried to win with genius. America had won with work. And in that lesson lay the future, not just of this war, but of warfare itself. The age of the craftsman was over. The age of the factory had begun. And Germany, for all its pride and all its engineering excellence, had never understood that. They had built monuments to precision and found themselves buried under an avalanche of adequacy. The .50 caliber fired 850 rounds per minute, someone had said. The number was probably wrong. It didn't matter. What mattered was that in those seconds of fire, everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, had been shredded beyond recognition. Hartmann closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. In the darkness, he could still hear it, that sound, that terrible, endless hammering, the voice of a world they had lost before they even knew they were fighting for it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.